Video 2 of lecture on broken spears. We've seen this image before. I've used it to talk about how we can see that the devil dance of the Oaxaca Californians is actually telling us a long historical feud between the Mexicas from Tenochtitlan and the peoples of the Zapotec and Mixtec kingdoms of the present state of Oaxaca. This map also shows us the different Tlatoanis, meaning the Aztec lord kings that expanded the Aztec Empire. We have Izcoatl, Moctezuma, Axayacatl, Tizoc, Ahuitzotl, and Moctezuma II. It was Moctezuma II who was the emperor when the Spanish arrived. Also very important to notice that Tlaxcala, Teotitlán, and the Mixtec kingdoms were never subdued by the Aztecs. Neither were the Mijes, nor these Mayan groups, nor these Otomis from Mestitlan, neither were the people of Tzintzuntzan, the Tarascans, present-day borders of Morelia and Jalisco. Okay? Now, let's get a close-up at the area of Tenochtitlan. This is going to help us understand the layout of the place. This is an image of the Lake Texcoco. This would be present-day Mexico City. If we would look in Google Earth, this would be just an metropolitan urban area. Back in the times of the Aztec Empire, this was the way that it was organized at the time of Cortez's arrival in the 16th century. Things that we don't know about the basin of Mexico around this time is all of these cities were controlled by the Aztecs. Each one had to pay tribute. The Aztecs exercised imperial authority and offered protection and political stability. They provided an integrated economic network with state polytheism. The Aztecs never enforced their gods upon anybody. Everybody had their own gods, and the Aztecs worshipped their own imperial cult. There, a very important person is Huitzilopochtli, which in some can be seen as the war god. Important things of the Aztecs is that social mobility was achieved by public education. These are peoples that had very important egalitarian notions of social mobility, and therefore everybody went to school. You could become a warrior or philosopher or remained as a merchant, depending on the type of abilities that you had, being a philosopher, warrior, or a healer. And they counter biologists and so on. They had a very strict code of law. They basically wrote poems, philosophy through poetry. They had theater, literature, and the classic flower wars. Flower wars were the sacred wars in which they engaged in order to provide captives, in order to bring them to the capital of Tenochtitlan and fight them in front of everybody. We will see how flower wars and this ethic of social mobility and hierarchies is very important to interpret present day's archaeological record. Now, this is an image of the city of Tenochtitlan. We can see that it was the perfect location. As you may know, and we will review it later, the Aztecs arrived to this valley of Mexico City when the lords of Azcapotzalco are rulers. And the creations of the city of Tenochtitlan comes as one of the engineering miracles of humanity, really, because they create a city, a floating city on a swamp. Okay, we'll review more on the mythical creation stories of the Aztecs in a moment. This map also shows us about what we call as the Triple Alliances, which is between Texcoco, Tlacopan, and Mexico Tenochtitlan, as they engage in warfare with other lords, particularly the lords of Azcapotzalco. Now, this is a symbol of their alliances, and this is what marks the rise of the empire of the Aztecs. Today, much of what we know is the remnant of the battles and the memories that people had in the fall of what we call the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. Very important is to understand the symbolism behind the act itself of the historiographical research that Miguel León Portilla brings to the table. Okay, and that is why the analysis of what Roque Dalton writes in his foreword in the Spanish version, in the first Spanish version, is so important. Who is Roque Dalton? Roque Dalton is a well-known Salvadorian poet who basically was imprisoned by the undemocratic dictatorial governments of Salvador during 59 and 60. He's exiled to Mexico, and later he goes to Cuba, because Cuba, as I mentioned before, there's a victorious revolution, okay? And it is in this hub of revolutionary ideals that Roque Dalton establishes an international reputation as a writer. He returns to Salvador in 1973, and very unfortunately, it seems like the revolutionaries or somebody in Salvador murdered him. That's an open question that is very controversial. But what's relevant about Roque Dalton's forward in the first versions in Spanish is that he argues that what he has read from the Broken Spears is a valid testimony of the general conquest of Latin America, a story where treachery, cowardice, and heroism and resistance of the natives, meaning the story of treachery and cowardice in the part of the conquerors and the heroism and resistance of the parts of the natives. That particular perspective we cannot see by reading the chronicles written by the Spanish chronicles. Therefore, in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, what Roque Dalton argues is that the work of the Broken Spears can be used to understand the present-day political historical violence in Latin America. As we shall unfortunately review, we'll see that the Broken Spears helps us understand political violence even today, if we mention places such as Standing Rock in the Dakota Territory, that, as we know, is even up to 2008, it has very intense issues of native resistance versus the oil industry's interest. So anyway, that's an important and relevant aspect to keep in mind of what is it that we're doing by learning about the work of Miguel León Portilla and the perspective of the Aztecs. Okay. Now, on both sides of the border, from Mexico in the United States, what we see in the Broken Spears is a critical, historic, and symbolic narrative fundamental in the creation of this collective consciousness. Therefore, the Broken Spears becomes a national character myth. It becomes a great epic poem of the origins of the Mexican nationality. This in the midst of a moment that in the academic world we start finding multicultural nations striving for writing and researching with ideas of cultural pluralism. We start seeing a repeated inference of civil rights movement, decolonization movements, and more importantly, of the importance of the academic to reflect that social diversity of the ethnic differences. Also is a response to demographic transformations of the non-Western others and cultural resistance. Okay? Therefore, in terms of historiography, what Miguel León Portilla is comparing documents of the 16th century in order to make sense of what happens in the historical record when we have sometimes contradicting accounts of the same events, or what is it that we can rescue from both of these contradicting versions. In that sense, what Broken Spears does is it validates that the letters found in Nahuatl written in Latin must have been written by students and people from the Franciscans who have arrived after the conquest of Mexico and had taught the Latin alphabet to the orphans of Mexico City, and therefore in their intent of converting the survivors of the wars in Tenochtitlan, what they did, they empower these young kids in order to go and interview the elders and capture what we call as the Huehuetlachtoli. Now, we have many writings from the 16th century, and this is a very important fact. Let's remember that the kids and orphans of Mexico City, they were not surprised by the grading systems. These were people that were going to school, had philosophy, theater, dance, astronomy, medicine, and so on. A long tradition of what we call native pictoglyphic text that had for thousands of years been registering knowledge. Now, we've reached the 10-minute mark. I will continue with this in the next video.